Hi, and welcome to VFX Tutors. I'm Josh, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing with this sword object track and our purge guy shot. So in the previous tutorials, in the photogrammetry ones, we've created this sword prop, and then we've sort of ingested some footage, and done a single frame lineup in 3D. So now we're ready to do our manual object track. So I've got my Maya file of my sword, so I'm just going to work in there. And we've got our prop sword, the one that we built on the previous one. And we've got our mesh. We can probably delete this now. We don't really need this. And the position ref. So we've just got our sword. So what we want to do first is, because we want to animate the sword, because we can do this all manually in Maya. So it's going to be mostly just animating our sword. Very similar to the rotor animation tutorials. But we don't really want to be animating really on just a group. You can, there's no problem with it, but it kind of can be a bit messy if we need to change anything or do anything with it. It's always better to sort of animate on controls or locators or something like that. So what we can do is just let's create a basic curve. And I'm just going to scale this up. And I'm going to go to my top-down menu. Like, we're not doing anything complicated here. We're just effectively making an object that we can put our sword under. So if we do add stuff to it, we can drop it under this curve. So I'm going to try and get that as close as I can. Just snap it in that axis. Okay, panels, perspective. And maybe gonna snap it up to the middle of this sort of the metal part of the hilt. And you can pretty much do anything you want to this. You can make it oval shaped or anything. I'm just gonna leave it like a circle. It's just something so I can easily select. Then I'm just gonna call this sword. Let's call CTRL for control. Then what I need to make sure is I freeze. In fact, actually, before I do anything, I just realised it's actually upside. So we're actually that way. And the sword is actually up. It doesn't probably matter too much, to be honest, but for the sake of it, let's actually put it the right way up. And let's freeze transformations on that. So now our sword's the right way up in the scene. It's just like sort of scene etiquette. You could have left it as it was, but it's nicer to sort of have it the right way up. So you always know the orientation. And we pretty much don't need to change anything else. So all we can do is just freeze our transformations on our sword control. And you can select sword group and just middle mouse click it under there. And it's as simple as that. So now all our animation will be done on this control. Like, so you can do it on a group or anything like that, but it's just kind of nice to make a small little controller for it, so it's just easier to animate. So it's going to be nothing complicated, that's pretty much it. So now we've done our single frame lineup and all the other bits, so let's import in our geometry, our camera and our geometry and our sword lineup. So we can go File, Import. So we're seeing our props there. Just going to match move. And go to the files that you've previously exported. And tutorial. So I'm going to import the single frame lineup. So now we have a scene here. And what I will do is just import the set geo. That one. Got the room set geo, so now we're in our room. And what we can do now, we can go File, Import, because the last thing we did a quick single frame lineup of the sword. So it would just help us, because sometimes it's easier to do lineups, single frame lineups or objects in 3D, even though you're more than welcome to try and track this in 3D, but I can guarantee you're going to get like jittery problems and it popping in and out of depth. And to be honest, whenever you like sort of work at a company and you're given an object track, 99% of it is probably going to be like this. You're going to be object tracking stuff mostly. Like with swords, they're not going to be like, I see a lot of tutorials on this, and you notice that all these balls, yeah, it makes it really easy to track. But this is never going to happen ever. Like, I've worked on countless Marvel and Disney films, and you will never see props with that sort of tracking markers, or those golf balls or tennis ping pong balls, because it distracts from the actions and the actors. So they will make the props as real as possible. They're not going to make it for you easy to track, basically. So like, there are very few object tracks that I've come across where you don't have to just do it like this. So this is probably the way you're going to end up doing it most of the time anyway. So yeah, and it's just going to teach you, it's going to give you the better skills to do object tracks and stuff, instead of doing tracking stuff which is never going to happen. Cool, so that over. So we've got our scene, and we've got our sword that we exported out from 3D. And we can like tidy this up a bit. Let's Control G that, and we'll just call this set geo. We'll just put GRP for group under it. We can drag and drop this under the scene, and Control G, and we'll just call this sword. Sword. We don't want to call it. Look. GRP. So now we've got a sword, a scene. So now we've just got a nice, really tidy scene. We've just got our match move scene and our sword animation that we're going to sort of use. So let's go to our panels perspective. And you can see we've got two cameras in here. So if we open it up, we don't need this. We can delete that. And we can go to our camera. We'll look through. Well, it's got timeline at 1. Let's make sure our timeline's matching it. And now you should see with our camera selected that we have our keys there. And there's keys on it. It's a solid non-moving camera, so yeah, we don't really need to do anything like that. All we need to do is we can select everything apart from the visibility, because we might want to hide it sometimes. Right click and lock. So now we can't break this or mess it up. It's locked in that place forever. We'll just select our camera, go to our tribute editor, and we need to change our image plane, because at the moment we've got, not that you can see it, but if we show polygons, we've got our original image sequence on there. So we need to replace this with our undistorted plate. So we have our undistorted plate here, and you can see it's a little bit down res because we've done it at half res, but it should be fine. We'll just use our image sequence. Let's change our alpha gain to 0.7 and our depth to 1. And let's show our polygons again. So it's entirely, so let's actually just get this up to our lineup. So we exported our sword at, I think 1104, and you can see it's lining up pretty well. So we just select our camera again, go to our image plane, and you can change your alpha gain to pretty much whatever's comfortable for you to track in. So see, everything sort of disappears after a while, but let's bring it down so we can see that a lot clearer. And let's change our color space to ACES CG, because you can see what the colors now. We've got the true colors because we transcoded our footage to ACES CG, so you can see the difference here. So it'll either come in at raw. Chances are you might accidentally be in sRGB, where it's going to show it very dark because it's linearized. So to show the true color space, it's on ACES CG. And if we let's just hide our set geo. You can see now we've got the true colors, which makes it a lot easier for us to do look dev and all that sort of stuff, so we can see exactly what's going on. Cool, so something like that. So yeah, let's move on with this. So we've imported everything. Everything's pretty much ready to go. And say if you didn't do this, let's just go through this sort of... The reason why I exported this out from 3D is because it's just really quick and easy to line up. So if I just tear off a copy. Let's turn my polycount off because I don't really need that. So the reason why I did this is because it's super easy to then just line up with that geo. But you may not have done that, so we'll just do a quick lineup of just say if you didn't have that. So even though we do have this, it's probably best I show you how I'd do it if I didn't have it. Because we know this is all at the correct sort of scale, we can sort of... The first thing that I'll always do is try and roughly... Even though this is completely out of depth, I'm just going to roughly match this angle. It doesn't have to be perfect because we can sort of refine it. So now you can sort... Let's also hide our set geo. So we're always selecting the sword control, and you can see, make sure that your axis orientation is on object, not world, otherwise you're going to get funny orientations. So always make sure you're on object. So all I've done is roughly sort of get this in the right angle, and all I'm going to do is just push it forward in depth. Let's start adjusting it roughly to line up here with just using the axis. Then luckily for like something like this, it's a static solid object, so they're usually pretty easy to sort of get your rough lineups. So I'm just going to zoom in, and I'm going to focus on this sort of handle side. If I'm just using my 2D pan and zoom, as you can see here. If you press backslash, it enables it. So to do that, you need to press backslash to enable 2D pan zoom, then hold backslash to right click to zoom in and out, and middle mouse button to translate round. So I'm just going to get this, see how this sort of hilt, I don't think it's here, it's called something else, but this sort of metal protector bit here. I'm going to roughly get that even all the way around, so it's still too small. So I'm just going to push it more in depth. And I'm going to now focus on getting this the right size. And whilst focusing on this, I can also see my handle sort of off. And remember that this bent quite a bit. So it's kind of like a... It's not a very strong prop. It does wobble around a little bit. All I'm doing is just doing very small movements. And I'm just going to do fine, small, very small movements basically. And if you've done any of the rotomation tutorials, we're basically going to do like our keyframes. And you can see like that's only taken, I've just roughly lined it up at the beginning and pushed it in the depth. And you can see that we've got a pretty good lineup already. It doesn't take, it's not a huge task to do without 3D. If we unhide our sword lineup, we can see how close we were. And it's a little bit, it's dependent, let's see which ones. So it's about the same. Let's hide our sword look. But as long as you got it in the correct depth, they probably will be slightly different. But all that matters is that you get it as accurate as possible. But that's how you do it in Maya. And the fact that they're slightly off is not a massive thing. In fact, if I just hide that one and have a look at this one, it kind of looks a little bit... I don't know if I rushed it, but... No. The one actually we've just done now in Maya actually looks... It looks much better. See, we've got all that. It's really close. All the way up to the edge. Actually, the handle's actually fitting quite well there. So maybe it's just been a... I don't know if we just round that off, it's still slightly off. But let's not worry about the handle, because we're not going to be replacing the handle. The only thing that we're going to be doing is just improving the sword. So that's completely down to whatever you want to do. Obviously, when you look at this, if you're you kind of want to... The plan is to replace it with something a little bit bigger, so we don't have to paint anything out of the clothing. We can just render over the top of the sword and roto out the guy. So it's not a super complicated thing. So we'll probably, after we've tracked it, we'll concept some sword ideas. Then we'll go through sort of making the sword. But the easiest thing for us to do is sort of build our concept around the sword, but make it bigger so we don't have to paint any of it out, because it's quite a lot. It's quite a big frame range. I'm not sure if we'll do the whole range, but we can sure give it a go. Anyway, so we've got our first lineup. So if we go to our channel box editor, like I say, you don't, well, because I'm using Maya, you don't actually have to use Maya. You can do this in any 3D software. If you're using Blender, 3ds Max, or God, I can't think what there's loads, but that seems to be the most common. Even Houdini, I guess you can do this in Houdini and stuff. I'm just using Maya because this is just what we use at work. So most VFX places use Maya, but there are like tons of other good software out there to use. So I'm pretty happy with that lineup. So if I go to my channel box layer editor, I can see I've got my translation rotations. So I need to make sure that these are keyed. So if I press S, that keys everything, or you can just select all your translations and rotations and key selected. Because we've kind of, when you press, select our control, when you press S, it just puts a key on everything. So that's including the scale and visibility. So we can actually lock the scale, because we don't ever want to change the scale, depending on how good our sort of sword is, but hopefully it should be pretty much perfect. So now we've keyed that on that position, what we can do, we can look through, if we go back to our 2D pan, if we look how much, we've actually got a lot of frames here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to track all the way back to, because I don't want to, this could turn into an absolutely massively long tutorial. So I'm just undecided whether to do 200 frames or do it shorter. But anyway, let's figure that out. Let's just get going. I'll see how long this takes, because after a while it'll be the sort of same thing over and over. So, but if you've done any of the rotomation ones, it's going to be pretty much exactly the same. We're going to start, so I'm just blabbering on now, sorry. So we've hidden all the geometry and we just start doing our key poses. Same thing as we did on the roto anim. I'm just going to go, I am going to go to, so I'm just going to look through and just sort of analyze. It's very good to look at your footage because it kind of also gives you an idea of how many key poses you want to do. So when we're doing sort of looking at this animation here, if we're looking at the sword, we can sort of see the movement's not really that bad. There's no rotations, it's just more moving up and down. It's more when we get to this part here, where I'm spinning it around and rotating it, we're going to need a lot of key poses, because it's probably going to go a little bit funny and do some flips and stuff. And probably here it's not so bad. Here we'll probably have to do quite a few key poses. And this bit here will be so fast, we probably won't even know what's going on. Because sometimes, like, that's just blur, and all you can do is do your best and try and keep it as logical as possible. It's like, if I had a decent rig, I would probably also do a lineup of the character and place the sword in his hand, so I can get the sort of position nice and the range of movement sort of more accurate. But for this, I'm not going to worry too much. So you can see these sort of movements. We're going to need more. We're going to need more key poses. But I'm going to actually work for the start, because they're more complex. Well, not complex. It's just a little bit more. You'd have to do more keyframes. So I'm going to work my way backwards through this simpler section. So I'm now going to got my start frame, and I'm just going to do it every 10 frames for now. So my next one is 1100. So using my 2D pan, I'm just going to press backslash and hold it and zoom in. And I'm going to try and not change the depth so much. I'm going to try and get everything with just the X and Y. So before I do that, you have a choice whether if you want to key it, pressing S every time, or keying it up here, or you can turn on auto key here, and that should be highlighted in red now. So that means every movement you do now is going to create a keyframe. So this is good if you just forget to do it, and I prefer working an auto key, but some people don't like it, because if you don't forget to turn it off, you're going to be keying everything. So just make sure once you're done, just make sure you turn it off. So I'm just going to go through the exact same process. Got to focus on getting this handle in. Luckily you can sort of see the shape of the hilt, which is kind of a squircle, I guess, like a round rectangle. And we'll get that lined up. Then we'll just zoom out and try and get this as best as possible. So the tighter we do get this, obviously, because we're keeping this part, we're probably just going to enhance this bit. So we want to make sure it's solid to here. But we also want to make sure that we are getting the best lineup for every single keyframe, because that means that we're going to cover up a lot of this, because I don't really want to do any extensive paint work on this. I just want to cover up the old sword with our new one. So now if I press greater than and lower than on my keyboard, I can skip through the keyframes, and I can just check that it's looking okay. We haven't done a huge range of movement. We can sort of check this on the wireframe as well. And we sort of see these two little black dots here. They seem to be working really well. And even though this blur is sort of, we may not get a perfect lineup on all of this, but as long as it's consistent throughout. So let's make sure, because it can be quite tricky, because even though it's just a basic sword, it can be very easy to get thrown off by small bits. But this is probably how you would end up getting object tracks in there whilst you're working at a company. And hopefully this shows you enough sort of skills to go straight into a job of doing stuff like that. So I'm just going on to 1090. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing. I don't really want to change. I want to try and keep moving the depth as minimal as possible, because that's where we start getting funny things happening. But we will have to do it at some point when things just aren't fitting. So I'm just looking at my hilt, looking where the handle is, and I know that it's sort of bent, so this may the handle and the sword may actually fit at some point, but I'm not relying on it. My main focus is getting this section and the tip of the sword quite tight, so I'm actually going to change the depth slightly because I think it's a little bit too big. And if you get your, because at the moment we're doing key poses, and if you get your key poses really tight, it's literally half the battle. And if you get them real nice, usually your in-betweens will be pretty good. And I'm just using my plus and minus to sort of raise the size of the sort of gizmo. I'm not sure if it actually helps, but I feel it does. Sometimes I feel it gives me more leverage, and I can move things a little bit smaller, in smaller amounts, sorry. So see, this is coming off here. We want to make sure that this is pretty good throughout. So if we use our greater than buttons, see, I've actually got a little bit of more rotation, so this is matching. It's always going to be quite tricky with the blur, but like I said, you can, with the blurry stuff, you can only do your best, and obviously it's not going to fit absolutely perfectly around this blur. So actually, but we can get it fitting perfectly around this sort of very in focus stuff. So we can see everything's working really nice. Let's just see what that tween's like. And you can see actually the movement's actually not too bad. It's very small slippings where we haven't keyed it, but we're going to worry about that in the tutorial after this, once we've done our sort of our main key poses. Cool, so I'm now just going to go through every 10 frames and do the same thing. So this could be, it might be repetitive, but it's kind of, I don't mind object tracking, it's quite nice, it's a bit enjoyable. And especially if you've got a nice model to work with and everything works. Sometimes you may not have the luxury. That is one thing that you might not have the luxury of, is having a model that works. Which it can be a bit of a pain, because obviously it's not going to line up as much as you want it to. So also another thing to sort of keep an eye out for is, obviously we can sort of see at the moment the character's arm is pointing all the way out, so there's probably very minimal depth movement up until there and there. So it's always good to keep an eye out on like the bending in the arms as well, because that can kind of help you figure out where stuff is. But I think for now it's going to be a range of extremely small shifts in depth. Cool. So for every single one, just going to sort of check it, seeing there's not anything wildly going wrong. And whenever you can, you kind of want to get, if you've got a lot of blur, you want to get it in the middle of the blur. Because when you do the rendering and stuff, obviously you're not going to have the exact same blur, but if you keep it in the middle, it will blend really nicely. So we can just have a look how that's tweening. You can see it's coming off quite a bit there, but that's expected because we're only doing the key poses. So then we go to 1070, and this is where it starts to come down a little bit more out of depth. Pull it down. And all I'm doing is just doing very rough positioning first, and I'll just go into the tighter lineups. And luckily we can see where these bolts are, so that helps tremendously. So there's plenty of stuff on here that we can see. So if you just pull that off to the side, we can see that everything's way too big. Our blade's way off there. So we need to go back in depth to make it smaller to fit. Let's rotate this round. Match up with those bolts. Sometimes if you just hide it just to see. See, we're still way too big, I think. Or we need to rotate more. So let's push it back. And I do see, sometimes I use the camera view quite a lot, but you also want to check in your perspective that you're not doing anything wildly crazy. Let's try and get that lined up. You can sort of see the shape here. Let's just check our blades sort of fitting. Because luckily the bolts are going to be quite handy because we've got a nice line of them. Maybe we're even still a bit too big. Let's get these bolts. Because you've got plenty of things for reference for the sort of positions. This is where it starts to get tricky. This is why we're kind of doing this bit first. Hard to see sometimes, but you can see we're getting these bits lining up quite nicely now. Cool, so those bolts are looking pretty good. Let's Even bring it back a tiny bit more. Let's look at our blade. The blade looks pretty good as well. We can sort of see the tip of our sword, and we know that it's sort of, there's a slight amount of bending in there. But like I say, our main focus is to get this bit working pretty perfectly, because it's the attachment that really matters. Because obviously this, we're going to render over the top of this sword, and hopefully we won't have to paint anything out. So it's always good to check in your perspective as well. Same with rotation. We've not moved a huge amount, but it looks like a fairly logical movement. You can see that it's kind of come off there where we'll have to put some more tweens in, but let's not worry about that too much. So let's go down to 1060. So let's get that sort of angle. And just from looking at the arm animation, we can see he's bringing his arm down and bringing it closer. So that's obviously got to go down. The more like sort of logical movements we can place in there before we start lining up, the easier it will become. So we've just pushed it down and brought it back a little bit. And now we can just see how well that lines up. Sometimes it's quite hard to see because it's rotated round. See, we're still quite big here around the edge. So let's bring it back and down. And a lot of times it's just a lot of very tiny movements. I actually think this needs to rotate. Because our handle is sort of going this way. And it is a lot of fiddling. But the more accurate you get this, the better it will be. Let's actually turn our hardware texturing off so we actually see what's better with it on. Because we can actually use some of these textures to help with our lineups as well. So we've clearly got, if we look at this sort of handle shape, you can see it's very rotated round, whilst ours is quite off. So maybe we've gone too far. If we just look at the size of those loops on there, we can see we're still quite big, so let's push it back even further. So when doing stuff like this, obviously the hardest thing to do is gauging the correct depth, which is something that you'll learn in time. This will be the difference between getting things lined up nicely. And it can be quite tricky to do sometimes. But with more practice, you should be able to do this quite easily. So I think our bolts are lining up nicely. Maybe you need to tilt it up and go up just ever so slightly. You see this actual front lineup took a little bit longer than the others. But I always like to spend more time on the more complex because it's moving down. In fact, if we go to our render, we can make this. Let's go to our anti-alias. Oh, it is on. Let's bring that down so it's not so heavy. Cool. So if we zoom out and use our greater than keys, we can see we're getting something really good here. And like I said, we're just going to keep going through. And we sort of see a rough animation there. So we're going to need more tweens for the larger range of movements. So let's now go down to here. And the same as before. Just going to try and match. I'm going to use this reference to match the sort of position. And I'm just going to slide it in. Push it in depth until it roughly fits. And when it's got a rough fit, we can tighten that line up. I'm just doing very small movements, pushing it in and out of depth. I can just hide and unhide it. It can be quite difficult to see when it's like this sometimes. I think we're still a tiny bit too big. Because we can see this edge here, and we can see the sort of hilt. So I'm just going to do very small adjustments, pushing it back in depth. Hide that, just check the line up. Maybe a tiny bit too big still. So we can see these sort of loop bits here are matching up and just about see the corner. Maybe we still need to go back a tiny bit more, maybe. So if we just have a look at our frames. So really have a look at this sword from the side. You can see if we sort of look at this and look at that sort of movement, it's bringing it down, rotating it around, and the sword is by the side, so it's looking fairly logical. So let's just check that line up. Obviously this is fairly rough, this handle, and obviously the thumb's probably covering some of it. So let's just slide for our timeline, see what we got. So it's looking pretty good. So let's now go to our frame 40. And if we just look, there's not a ton of movement between that, so it's probably slightly going back and a little rotation. So as usual, let's zoom in using our 2D pan. Let's try and match the sort of position, the rotation of it. Then we can see that we've got to push it back quite a bit. Well, not a huge bit, just enough to shrink it down. We can see that our bolts are sort of fitting quite nicely. And like I say, you're more than welcome to try and track this in 3D. From experience, I just say there's no point. I wouldn't bother. This is probably quicker and gives you less problems. But you're more than welcome to try. But this is pretty much the way you'll end up doing it, I'd expect. Like I say, you're never gonna get ping pong balls or mark. Well, you might get someone that puts a little bit of green tape on there, but nothing that's going to be really anything that's trackable apart from doing it this way. So this is only just going to help you sort of get the correct skills, I would hope. And I guess it sort of teaches some basic animation. Because we are just effectively just animating this, so it's yeah, if you're into animating, you probably will love this. It's a good way to sort of get a good animated reference as well. So as it gets further away into the darkness, it gets a little bit more difficult. But we're making some good ground. So let's go to, obviously these last bits are going to be the easiest because there's barely any movement. So let's go to frame 1020. Can't really see what position it is. So let's just line that up. I'm just using the H button to hide and unhide so I can just see what it looks like. And if you're having trouble with the brightness of this, if you select our camera, we should be able to bring up the gain unless it's not maxed out. No, it's already maxed out. We can't change that. Okay, so let's not worry about that. Make sure you don't change the pivot point. Cool, so let's go back, just check our frames, let's see. See, it's something quite off there. So now our sword is bent, but it's not that bent. So this, even though we're not relying on the entire sword because it's wobbly, we still want to use it for some sort of reference. You may even find going back through keyframes, you might want to change some of your poses. Let's go to our 1010. Let's get a bit further away and a bit more blurry. So it's getting increasingly harder to see, but you can just about make out details. I feel like we might be pushing it a little bit too far in depth. I think one of our frames here, I think what 1040 is off because we may have missed the handle, because I just noticed the frame, so it's looking a little bit funny, but I've just noticed the handle sort of like coming up here, so it's always good to just double check everything. Now you can see that the movement's a little bit nicer, so it looked a bit jumpy. I was just wondering why. Turns out I may have missed the handle. So it's good to keep that in sort of position as well. It does look like that's jumping in depth quite a bit. So it's starting to look a little bit more of a natural movement now. It's not jumping from my arm. Where previously it looks like it was traveling further than my arm. So let's just go back and refine that position. And as you see, it's looking much more natural. I think we can see the tip of the sword there, so that's probably to get in there as well. I'm just making sure everything's lining up nicely. So let's just go to our last frame, well, our first frame. Okay, so we'll get that rough position. You can see that our handles there. And let's just get this lined up as tight as possible. So I think that's pretty good. If we just scrub for our timeline, we can see we've got a pretty wobbly track, but our keyframes are looking pretty good. So what we do is start going from the other way. So before you do anything, make sure you save this. You didn't just go File, Scene Save As, so you don't lose any of your stuff. Cool. So now let's go. We've done our keyframes here, so now let's go through the other way, because now we've got way more movement, so it's going to be a little bit more tricky. So we might need more key poses, but let's carry on doing it 10 frames at a time, just so it's not turning into like a... because these tutorials will probably take quite a long time, because it's a lot of manual stuff, but also a lot of attention to detail. So let's just zoom in. Let's just try and get that lined up there. Obviously we're losing the tip of the sword there, so now that's where it starts to become a little bit more difficult, where we can't see all of the sword. But we've still got the handle and all the bolts. You can see the edge of the blade here, so we need to rotate that around quite a bit. So when you come at angles, it can be quite a bit difficult to see. Go to our perspective view. I'm going to bring this down, back a tiny bit. Still need to rotate it a bit. I'm going to try and get this lined up as best as possible. So it's kind of looking alright there. And we can see our sort of tween is way off, but we're only doing our key poses. And this is going to be a bit... they're going to look a bit worse on this, where it's faster movements. So we're just going to do the same thing, go through all the main keyframe lineups. So while still looking at how the range of movement that the character's kind of doing, the depth doesn't seem to be changing too much. It's just mostly within a couple centimeters in front of him. So I'm hoping we should be able to get a lot of these lineups fairly easy without having to adjust the depth too much, because that's where it starts to become tricky. Sometimes you just can't see, so you just try to pull it away. So you always want to try and keep everything in the center of the blur. And if we look at our can't see those bolts. So that looks like can become quite tricky to find the position. Luckily we can we've got lots of shapes here to sort of giving it away. And these bolts are probably, the bolts, handle and the hilt are going to be most useful to us. It's probably a little bit too close. Even though it's wobbly, the sort of tips should line up. This should give us a good idea of the depth. It's looking pretty good. So at the moment I'm just looking at these bolts, trying to get them all look fairly good. Then I can see the tip of this, so it actually needs to rotate a little bit more. But it's hard to tell if it's the sword that's wobbling or not. You have to take a best judgment with the sword, because it does flex and wobble. So in between those two keyframes, we've got quite a big movement. So we can sort of see that the tween is quite rough, but we can get that on the second pass. So if these bigger movements, it's going to look a bit nastier in the middle compared to these, where it's a bit nicer, just floaty. But these ones will need more tweens. So I'm just going to carry on. See, like, even with this, there's no way that it's going to figure out the correct movement between this frame and that frame. So there's just too much movement. All we can do is just try and get the best lineup. Because even when we do our refinement afterwards, we'll probably still have to adjust these frames. So I'm just going to get a rough lineup first. I'm just going to bring it up. And you can see why this is, if you have a model that you've already made and you've built it from accurate geometry, this is so much easier. Because if you don't have that and you have to do it with geometry that someone's randomly built and it's kind of not accurate, it makes things a lot more difficult. This is why I always would advise working with scans and set geo and really preparing all your stuff, because it just makes your life so much easier. You've already got this sort of stuff's already quite a tricky job to do. There's not really many people that can do it or want to do it, so you need as many things as possible to make it easier for you. And having accurate geometry is the key to most of your pain. Because if this wasn't accurate and it was just randomly made and by some modeler and didn't pay attention to any of the sort of sizes of it, this wouldn't fit in all the angles. It might fit in the one frame that they modeled it from, but that's not what we want. We want it to fit on every single frame, which this model does. And I'm sure if you've tried object tracking manually before, or just any object tracking before, you've tried it with some sort of rough geometry that may have been roughly made or something, it's very tricky if you haven't got the right model. And you can see now that all of this is just lining up perfectly, which means a much nicer track for you. This still teaches you all the same stuff, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it. It's probably going to be a very long tutorial series just for this sort of shot, but I'm trying to squeeze in as much as I can with work as well, so sorry if I haven't been posting as much as I have done before, but hopefully we should have some more interlinked stuff. So I'm quite happy with that sort of lineup. If I zoom out, you can see most of our stuff's working pretty nicely. So if we actually go through that, you can see it's actually not done a bad job, to be honest. It's kind of roughly figured it out. Obviously we need to refine it. So let's go to 1140. And we can just, I just do the same thing over and over. Get my first initial lineup, sort of get this matching. I'll just drag it across. I'll just try and mimic the movement as much as possible. But, we've got plenty of stuff to sort of use as lineup reference. Push this forward because I think that the hilt is a little bit small. Zoom out, just so obviously I've probably said this like quite a few times already. The sword is a bit flexing, so it may not fit perfectly in every single position, but I would probably say that it's probably extremely close. So, but I'm still going to always prioritize this end, the bolts and stuff. Sort of see that needs to come back. She might be a bit too big. It can be quite difficult to see where all the bits are. You can just about see where the bolts are here. Probably about right there. Let me just push it a tiny bit back. Trying to get all this matching nicely and evenly. So those are lining up pretty well. Just a tiny rotation up. If we zoom out and skip between our keyframes, let's have a look at our perspective. Just here. And yeah, it looks fairly logical. It's doing the move. See how all the tweens worked. It's obviously missed out all the finer bits, but let's not worry about that. Let's just go to this frame, 1150. So this is like almost right in front of our faces. Cool, so this is a sort of just in time for Halloween as well. If you like Halloween, it wasn't planned, but if you want to do some Halloween VFX, you now have this purge guy. We'll try and hopefully I'll have time to do the background on all the roto stuff as well, all the keying. Maybe try a bit of both. At the moment, we're just going to focus on getting the sword. So I find a lot of the... Sometimes people get stuck on object tracking stuff because it's not... Some people will expect it just to track it in 3D or whatever tracking software they got and they should get a perfect one, but it's hardly ever like that. This is what usually happens. This is why stuff isn't probably going to be automated as well, because I'm not sure how they would even possibly think about making software to do this. That's why there'd always be match movers, I think. Which there seems to be a lot of people asking in the future of match move. So if you can get a computer to do all this, yeah, I'm sure there won't be long, but it's very unlikely you'll be able to get a computer to, or AI to sort of do stuff like this. So I wouldn't worry too much. So we're just going to go through all these keyframes and get them really nice lineups. Seems like a little bit close. So if things just aren't fitting like, you should be able to get it pretty perfect. Like, you shouldn't have things that are wildly off. You shouldn't be going, oh, why is this like crazy off? These should be pretty close. And the bolts in these holes. Cool. So it's only a tiny movement. So if we look at our tween, it's not so bad. Because I said at the beginning that we probably wouldn't do the whole thing because it's a lot. We'll try and do it because at the end of the day we're probably going to have to keyframe every single key on this. So it's probably going to take quite a while, but it'll be worth it. Most stuff you're doing like this is going to have to be tracked every keyframe anyway, so it's kind of unavoidable. And it saves you a lot of time messing around as well, so you can just skip the sort of, can I do it in 3D or just go straight to this? Personally, I prefer doing it this way. It's much nicer. It's a little bit more enjoyable doing object tracks this way because you don't have to do loads of 2D tracking. Then you don't have to fix it because you'll get loads of depth pops and stuff like that. It's yeah, you can filter it out and stuff like that and smooth it out, but this is much more enjoyable, I think. And if it's enjoyable, it becomes easier. So it's pretty close. So we're coming close to the end. 1080. 1180, sorry. Yeah, it's actually doing these single frames is a lot easier actually because he's just waving it around in front of him. And when we do like we'll do some sword concepts as well. So you don't have to do mine, you can do any sort of sword, just have some fun with it. I'm undecided whether to do sort of realistic or just do something wacky. It'd be funny to see him with a giant Final Fantasy sword or something. So this is where it starts to get a little bit trickier because there's a lot of fast, big movements. But I'm just going to do the exact same as I did before. So between those frames, it's gone a long way. So we're definitely going to need more in betweens. So I'm just matching the sort of rotation and angle. I'm just going to use my translations and just pull it in. So I'm just going to keep doing that until I'm matching the length. So see, the faster the movement, it gets a little bit more difficult because we can't really tell. Can't really see much of the detail, but what we can do is we can actually see some detail. So if we hold it, we can sort of see our bolts and stuff and this sort of edge here. So just by looking at that, I can see that we're actually more tilted that way and rotate it around like this. Bring that up. So we're in a quite fast movement, so we're definitely going to get a wobble or something here. So the best thing we can do is just try and make it as nice as possible. Because you're never going to get it. Well, you should be able to get it pretty close. Just do very small adjustments to sort of get the sword the right size. I feel it's actually a little bit more rotated that way. Bring it up. It's a very angry purge guy. Give it a sword. I guess you could even use it as an element as well. Stick an element off someone's back of someone's head in there and have them chop it off. But for now, we'll just keep it basic as a replacement. Cool, so if we just look at that, we can see there's a ton of movement there, so it's not going to quite get it. But it's got the rotations fairly alright, it's just the position. So let's go to 1200. So I'm actually unsure if doing one on 1200 is worth it, because that just kind of lies on a keyframe that we may want to leave as a tween. These are all not great keyframes to do lineups on. So let's do one on 195. So let's do it on the 5th frame, because there's no way I can distinguish what's great there. I have to sort of probably do one on 195 and probably on one on last frame where I can see it the clearest, just so I'm not adding any sort of these sort of key poses to add in our most accurate sort of positions, and I can't distinguish where that is really, unless I have a body in there as well. But to place it in his hand, that's why sometimes it's better to have a rig and have him holding on the hands. But for this case, I don't have that. And sometimes you just won't have that anyway. So we see the hilts up here. It's a little bit rotated around like that. I think we may have gone too far back in depth. See our hilt here, and we kind of need to bring it up like this. So see our rotation kind of feels off, feels a bit more like that. So it's always looking at these sort of lines, getting the best sort of, because we can see this line here and the edge of this sort of bracket here and the bolts and detailing on the sword. So we might just have pulled it too far back in depth. So it's just a load of fine tuning. You can see that's fitting nicely. So now if we skip between our keyframes, we can see we've got something alright there, but we can do a tween there maybe, but I'm kind of wanting to, I'm probably going to end up doing most of this manual keyframe anyway, so let's just go to frame 2012. Let's get that rough line up. Let's drag it across, because we can actually see some stuff on this frame. And hopefully the tween should help us. So this is moved. You can see my arms, so the arm is stretched all the way out. So we've moved quite forward in depth. Swung around quite a bit. So hopefully if we get a really decent lineup, see, it becomes very difficult to distinguish what's what. I think we can almost see where the bolts are. You can sort of see a glint of the bolt here. And if we just go back, we can see we've got a massive movement here between such a short keyframes. So if we just... It's never going to really tween that well, but it's actually got some of the movement quite nicely. So what we can do is... maybe do a tween, a single frame, maybe on, what's that? Which one? Maybe 1199. Let's try that. So let's bring that in. Let's line that up. Obviously this is going to have to come forward quite a bit. So let's just check that tween. Key pose, sorry. It does seem to have helped. We still have to refine it like a lot. I have a feeling we're probably going to have to do this frame by frame. Well, we will definitely have to do it frame by frame, but go through it sequentially. But it's kind of working here on the in-betweens. If it's working like now, it's just putting that keyframes helped quite a bit. You see how that's kind of following it now. Just that bit, but yeah, so we've sort of done our single frames. So if we go through them all, we can see we've got a nice blocked out animation. You want to spend time getting these lineups really nice because it just means it will be less work for you in the long run. But I think with this, we're probably going to have to sort of manually track quite a lot of it anyway. So that's a lot of keyframes. But it should be cool once we're done. So we're done with this first half, just doing the key poses. So yeah, if you've enjoyed this tutorial, hit that like button and subscribe for more like this.